Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a Celtic-inspired fantasy sword from Perna Danal, a one-of-a-kind custom piece, courtesy of Swordfriend Matt, who sent this graciously my way for my particular brand of review and destruction. So before I get into it, some caveats. One, as noted, this is a sample, or rather a piece graciously donated for posterity by Swordfriend Matt. So special thanks to him, but also know I didn't spend any money on it. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. Two, this is a second-hand item, so Swordfriend Matt didn't buy it originally from Perna Danal. Somebody else commissioned it, and there are some things about the sword that are not the way it originally came from Purna. One edge has been ground in such a way that it created a secondary bevel. That was done by Swordfriend Matt. Along with that, there was a window etched into it to see if there was any differential hardening or what was up with the heat treatment. So the black streak on it is a window done with etchant. That was not original to it. And then the scabbard as well, from my understanding, is not the original. I don't know if it was done by Purna later, but from my understanding, it is not the original scabbard. So those are the things that I note on top of general secondhand wear and tear, that kind of stuff. But anything that I have for links to the way it originally was will be in the description down below, as well as measurements and all of that kind of stuff. One additional note, this was a $750 commission to Perna Danal. At least that's my understanding of the original cost, and that's what I'm going to keep in mind as I think about if it's worth it or not, or would I recommend it or not. But I can't attribute the design elements to Perna. As I understand it, this is a commissioned sword that had some design elements provided by the customer, and I don't know honestly the whole story, but given that it was likely a custom commissioned sword, any pro or con in terms of how it handles, the dynamics of it, or the general design of it, I don't know if I can attribute that to Purna or the customer. And so I can go over the BitBob Fit features, and hopefully the video gives you some idea of what to expect from Purna if you're thinking about having a sword commissioned from him, or if you spot something secondhand on the used market and want to know what to expect. Hopefully this gives you some guidance there. But anyway, back in my mind, I'm thinking $750, but I won't critique it the same way I typically do, because this isn't like a thing you can go buy exactly. And anything that I were to kind of point my finger at and say, hey, Purna did this or that, that could have been specified by the customer. I don't know the answer to that one, but maybe the original owner will chime in if he happens to see this video. On with the reviewing. I'm going to start with the pommel right here, and what I can tell you is that this is a hand detailed, it looks like hand carved style pommel, at least the detailing on it is, and it's in the shape of a scent stopper pommel, but a little bit different. Either way, I like the size and scale of the pommel, and the detailing looks crude, but at the same time has a charm to it. I don't know whether I can again attribute that design to Purna or to the original designer of the sword, but it was reasonably well executed. Well, the lines wander a little bit, and it doesn't have symmetry or perfection. It has charm, and I happen to overall like the pommel. It's decorated on all sides, and while it looks like one big solid piece of brass, it looks, once the handle broke off, it appears that it's filled with pitch. And the good news is that it didn't break off. Sometimes when things are filled with pitch or resin, and I abuse them the way I tend to, they come undone, and the tang is still seated inside the pommel. There's also a mechanical connection that's at the end of a peen block. It's peened on, or at least it looks like it is. Now, that little peen block at the end prevented me from using the palm of my hand and kind of pushing on the base of it. I honestly think I would have liked it a little bit more if it were flat instead of having that peen block on. While it wouldn't be good to get thumped with it, it prevented me from doing some additional kind of reinforced thrusts with the, my extra hand, if you will, my second hand. Anyway, I do like the pommel overall. I like the design. All of the little hand engravings don't have any hot spots. Nothing bites into my hand. Overall, I thought it was pretty well done. And I like the versatility that it gave me, because that extra large pommel let me grip with my second hand if I wanted to, for some reason, hold this very short sword with two hands. But I digress. The point is, I happen to like the overall execution of the pommel, and tip of my hat to Purna, because it stayed on there through all of the very aggressive treatment that I gave this sword. Now, if I move up to the grip didn't fare so well. This was a wooden grip, and initially it had a beautiful look to it. It had, again, the same kind of hand-carved details on the wood. It had a charming look to it, and it indexed well. It also felt smooth but grippy. I know that's two things that seem divergent, but if I hold it in a bare hand, if my hand was wet, if I stuck it in the snow or got sweaty or something like that, it didn't slip at all in my hand. It felt very secure. It could be that the details or the carvings kind of gave my fingers something to grip onto, or something that stuck into my hand over the not necessarily slippery wood, but smoothed wood. I also liked the shape. It indexed really well. I didn't have a problem with it rolling in my hand, and it offered a little bit of versatility in terms of the way I could grip it. I could choke up and get two hands on it. If I wanted to get a little bit more reach, I could keep a single hand down by the pommel. Either felt pretty secure in my hand, but I did find my hand resting in really primarily one point, 2 fingers above that kind of central rib section and 2 below. When I held it that way, though, it locked in and it was very comfortable. It's also worth knowing in the swing, well, I'll talk about cutting later, I didn't feel any shock. It didn't pinch my hand. It didn't chafe. It didn't hurt. I used it with and without a glove, and in either case, there were no kind of reverberations or anything that bit into my hand or anything that caused me discomfort in swinging. And given what I was swinging at, that is kind of a surprise. Sometimes some of those sharp little ledges that index well end up rubbing or chafing or kind of banging into your hand in a way that's uncomfortable in hard use, which I didn't find here. Now, the grip did break apart in some use, but it went well into the abusive section before it broke apart. Cutting logs, being very aggressive with a chop, didn't manage to break the grip, but once I started throwing it at a tree, the little bone sections at either end, which were lovely details, did chip off and break. And it looks like from some of the original photos, I'm speculating here, but I think that bone piece may have been cracked before. Bone can be very brittle. It's not quite the same as horn, though that can be brittle as well. But those little details popped off when I was throwing it at a tree. Obviously, damage being thrown at a tree, it's not a terrible surprise, but it would have been nice if the bone pieces didn't chip or kind of explode off the grip. The wooden part of the grip, though, did hold on all the way until I started slapping the flat of the blade against what I've come to call the tree of woe, because it's broken a few swords. Now, the sword didn't break slapping the tree of woe, but the grip basically shattered off, and so all the bone parts were off, and then the flats or the glued on portion of the grip, the wooden part, broke off in 2 slabs or 2 slats of wood that conceivably I could glue back on if I wanted to, but they came off and the sword was really no longer usable. I did basically wrap around like an extra sleeve that was a remnant of a sweater that I had cut in testing, and I used that to kind of makeshift absorb some of the shock and some of the other tests that I was about to do. But normally I would stop there. Sword for Matt donated this and wanted me to see it pushed all the way to failure, so I did a makeshift grip. Normally the grip exploding would be enough for me to stop, but I pushed the sword later to failure. The point that I'm trying to make here, though, is that the grip came apart through very, very aggressive action. I'm not surprised that it did. In fact, I'm kind of surprised it lasted as long as it did. But some sort of cord wrapping or some sort of leather binding or some sort of something here would have helped it stay together, and if there were a little bit more mechanical reinforcement on the grip, I don't doubt that it actually would have held up all the way through the testing. I'm going to talk about the crossguard, which is something I'm both impressed and disappointed by. From a design perspective, the crossguard has a friction fit mechanism where you press it on and it holds the scabbard on, which I think is kind of a smart way of doing it. Anyway, I like that little design nuance. But also from a design perspective, there's no detailing that runs around the outer edge of the crossguard, and it's the shiny area of brass that really pulls my eye in. All the rest of the brass and all the rest of the grip and everything had this design element that flowed really well. It even does on the scabbard, and this large flat sweep of brass just pulls my eye in, and I think it's a missed opportunity to include some ornamentation. Apart from that, it was fit actually pretty well. So the craftsmanship side of things, the assembly, it's just a flat piece of brass that's pressed on the base of the blade, and there weren't any areas where I could see the other side through, no gapping or anything like that. I honestly thought there was a slat cut in where the blade rested inside it. I thought I would eventually find out when I broke it apart, which I did, but that is not the case. It is just resting on the rounded side of the blade, the shoulder of the blade, and then where the tang has a hole that's cut through, it's also cut really, really well. There's no giant gap or anything like that. I thought the fitment was really quite good. From a custom maker's perspective, very often these are, well, it's a pain in the butt, I'd imagine, to file it to be just fit through and not have a larger gap. That was done here, and I appreciate the additional attention to detail there. I would have liked to see a little bit more detail around the edge, but at the same time, I don't know if that's the desire of the original commissioner, or if that's Purna. I'm not exactly sure on that one, but to my eye, I would have liked to see the design flow around the outside of the crossguard as well. Anyway, I could be totally off. Maybe historic swords don't have that. Maybe that wasn't what the original commissioner wanted. It's just, to my eye, I would have liked to see it there. Anyway, the Scabbard. I don't believe that the Scabbard was actually made by Purna. From what I can find online, the original Scabbard was a bit of a disappointment to the original owner, and I don't know if this is a second attempt by Purna or if the original owner had somebody else do it, so I'm not going to touch on it too much, but I will say, again, there's the little nuance where the crossguard creates a fiction fit. I thought that that was good, and the Scabbard overall is nice. I like the design that flows through. It doesn't rattle a lot. It fit the blade really well. Retention was overall quite good. At the same time, I could pull the blade or deploy it pretty easily without, it falling out if I bent over to pick something up, which I do often because, ooh, there's a piece of candy. No, I'm kidding. The point is that I thought the Scabbard was pretty nice, but given that I'm not 100% sure it's Purna's work, I'm going to kind of stop talking about it here. On to the blade, the pointy, stabby part, and there is a lot to look at and take in here. There's a lot of geometry and kind of cool stuff going on. From a general lines perspective, the edges waver and wander just a little bit, not grotesquely, but enough to irritate you if you're looking for perfection. The central ridge wanders around a little bit, and there's ripples in the surface of the steel that look like kind of hammer marks that weren't ground all the way out. So if you're, again, looking for perfection, it's not present here, but if this is a handmade, hand-forged object, it doesn't surprise me that those kind of things are present. It's not as bad as what you'd find in a windlass object, but if you're, again, looking for pristine, it's not that. In terms of geometry, though, there's just a lot of cool stuff going on with the blade. The crossguard makes this big lump of steel that is still pretty thick, and then it very quickly narrows down to just about above an inch. And again, those dimensions are linked in the description down below. The point is, though, that then it swells out to around 2 inches before it tapers down. That central ridge is reinforced all the way to the tip as well, which is going to make that tip last a little bit more if you're delivering thrusts. And it definitely feels stout in the hand. That weighted tip moves around, and it's not particularly nimble for a sword of its size. Usually swords around this size feel a lot more agile, but at the same time, from other blades of this style that I've felt, especially some antiques that I've been fortunate enough to feel at the Oakshott Institute, which aren't exactly this sword, but are similar, also have a very tip-heavy, hefty, stout feeling to it. So I don't think it's uncharacteristic of blades with this profile. Anyway, there is a lot to take in, but all of the important bits are there. That reinforced tip is really cool, and there isn't a secondary bevel apart from the one that Swordford Matt put on. And there's a little bit of meat behind the edge as well, which aided later when it met the croquet stake of doom. Anyway, from a general build quality perspective, it seems to have tasteful distal taper, and the lines and all the important bits are there, and it certainly held up reasonably well when I went to cut, and also performed well, which is, I guess, the next part I should talk about. So in terms of actually using the thing, how well did it do? Well, I cut pool noodles, I cut water bottles, I cut logs and kind of branches in my backyard, and overall it went well. Now bear in mind that it's below 30 degrees outside when I'm testing this, so it's below freezing, and it's holding up overall pretty good. It cut pool noodles apart. Pool noodles tend to be a little bit easier to cut in the cold, but still it's popping them apart. I'm having some luck cutting with it. Water bottles, again, I'm cutting through the water bottles, not just batting them around, which is kind of what I expected. It's actually cutting them apart, and I'm not doing any kind of graceful cuts. It's still a pretty thick sword and still pretty choppy in a form that I'm not familiar with. I'm making excuses. I'm not particularly great at cutting. The point is, though, that it cut the water bottles. It didn't tear them apart or just bash them apart. When I went to cut branches and things like that as well, I noted before that I didn't feel a lot of vibration or bite in my hand. It was a comfortable thing to be aggressive with and chop branches and stuff into. It also bit into those branches really, really deeply and broke them apart. I didn't notice any problems with the grip. I didn't notice anything coming apart, anything rattling. Overall, it held up pretty well, and I was kind of expecting the handle maybe to have some problems. Bone is particularly brittle. I've had it break off on other handles before. I was kind of expecting those little inserty areas to pop off. Anyway, they didn't. It held up well. It bit in really deep, and it was effective as a cutter. I didn't have a problem moving it around. Dynamically speaking, again, it's not particularly nimble in the hand. It has a really authoritative cut. I feel like I could get the point where I want, but it's not as agile as typically short swords are. So I focused on the choppy side of things. Now, when I went to the more abusive side of things, as in throwing it at a tree, this is where it started to have some problems. So again, I lost the little bone bits on the side, and I threw it at a tree several times. Sometimes I even hit the tree. Other times it kind of flew off or went into the ground. But I didn't notice that the tip was deformed from being thrown and driving itself into the ground. It hit the side of the the grip and the side of the blade a few times. And apart from the little riser, the little bone fragments in there, it didn't look like it was having too much trouble. The last throw, though, did show a bend, and it bent the sword near the base of the blade, the thinner side, the thinner part of the blade, just above where the crossguard portion ends. A couple slaps, though, and it was back to straight, and I could continue on with the abuse. So I then brought it to the Tree of Woe, and the Tree of Woe has gotten that name because it needs to come down. It's very ugly, and it's also broken a few swords. So I slapped it on the side of the tree, and several slaps, the sword would bend, basically, and it's soft enough where it's bending near the ricasso area, or not the ricasso, but that thinner part of the leaf blade, and then it's also bending in the meatiest part of the leaf blade as well. So it takes a bend, but it's not breaking in half. And when I really wound up and struck it, that's when the grip came apart. Now, again, normally I would typically stop. The grip coming apart is a critical failure, and it doesn't leave me a lot of room to continue. But in this case, Swordfish Matt wanted me to push it all the way to failure, to test the steel more rigorously. And so I did. I took a piece of shirt that I had wrapped around a water bottle that I cut. Incidentally, you're able to cut water bottles with old sweaters around them. It cut through fabric and whatnot really well as well. Anyway, I wrapped that around to use as a makeshift handle, and I brought it to the Croquet Stake of Doom. So the Croquet Stake of Doom is a mild steel rod, basically, that I put into my stand. I hit the Croquet Stake of Doom in the first couple whacks. It basically just, it takes less than a millimeter out of the edge. I'm actually really impressed with the edge retention here. This is something that even I could sharpen out. It didn't seem all that cumbersome to resolve. It was pretty minimal damage for what I typically see to the Croquet Stake of Doom. And given how well it cut through pool noodles, I really wasn't expecting it to, I thought it would take more damage than it did. I thought the edge was more fine, but it had enough meat behind the edge where it really wasn't taking that much damage from the Croquet Stake. But when I leaned into it and struck it several more times, eventually the edge, or the blade, broke in the thicker section of the leaf blade. And that was a little bit surprising. I thought I'd have to reverse it and turn it around and strike the other side. I didn't have to do that. It was just several meaty swings into the Croquet Stake of Doom, and eventually it broke apart. Now, again, ideally, I flip it around the reverse side, and it still doesn't break, and then I have to take it on edge v edge sword, and then flip it around and bring it back to the Croquet Stake. In an ideal world, I have to start diminishing the sword with tools because I can't break it. So getting to the Croquet Stake of Doom is an accomplishment. Not every sword does. But breaking as quickly as it did is a little bit disappointing, but still well within reason. In a quick examination of the grain structure, it appears to be a reasonably tight grain structure. I don't make out coarse stuff like that, and I don't know much about Purna or his process, but usually kind of handmade, less expensive, one-of-a-kind custom pieces, I'm often expecting a pretty coarse grain structure and something that is a little, well, a less than ideal heat treatment. And while I don't doubt that this steel could have been capable of more with maybe a more elaborate heat treatment, it still appears to be an overall good grain structure, and it doesn't give me any pause in thinking that like it's not heat treated correctly or something like that. Anyway, it looks good to me, but I'm not a metallurgist. But normally if I can make out the grains with my naked eye, that's not a great sign. In this particular case, it has a very fine texture, and that's usually the mark of a well heat treated sword. Anyway, I'm speaking over my pay grade here. I don't know much about what it's supposed to look like, but it is something I look for, and generally the ones with a tighter grain structure like this tend to hold up well, which, in fairness, this one did. So that's all the stuff I can tell you about it in terms of build quality and fit and features, and now I can answer the question, do I personally think it's worth it or not? The short answer, Sword Friends, is yes, I do. I do think it's worth the $750. Now, there are some crude things here, there's some downsides, and I've spent the better part of a half an hour talking about them, but there's also a lot of pros. And the one pro that really sticks in my mind is that this is a one-of-a-kind custom piece. Now, if somebody was surprised by some of the asymmetry and imperfections, that wouldn't necessarily be great, but I don't know of anyone who can do perfect work for $750. So that price is also kind of baked into the expectations there. And what you get is this, well, conceivably, somebody had this in their imagination and then worked with Purna to make it a reality. And the fact that that's possible for under $1,000 is really kind of a cool thing. The fact that it's possible in a sword that is functional, durable, reasonably well made, has generally the blade notes in the right spot, and feels overall the part, is even more impressive. So yes, I do think it's worth it. If it were an on-the-shelf blade from Windlass made in the hundreds, I don't think I would make that same argument, but that's not what it is. It is a one-of-a-kind custom piece, competently made, albeit with some handmadiness charm to it. At the same time, I would argue, yes, I do think it's worth it. Now, hopefully this gives you some idea of what to expect if you were thinking about having Purna make a blade, or you had your own fantasy design in mind and wanted to see it made into reality on a budget. This is maybe some of the build quality that you can expect in that kind of budget. Hopefully that helps. Also, if you find something online in the secondhand market and you're wondering, hey, how well do Purna's blades hold up? Hopefully, again, this gives you some idea. All right, sword friends, that's all I've got. Special thanks again to Swordfriend Matt for sending this my way. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Cheers, and thanks for watching.